For centuries, sailors swore they saw women in the water. Half human, half fish, singing from the rocks, luring ships toward the reefs. It sounds like folklore built entirely from imagination, the kind of story that grows in the dark and dies in daylight. But something strange happens when you actually chase this myth back through history. You don't find nothing. You find a creature. A real one. Slow-moving, strange-looking, and in some cases enormous enough to be mistaken for a monster from the deep. So the question isn't really whether sailors were lying or hallucinating. The question is what they were actually looking at, and why an animal built more like a barrel than a woman ended up as the basis for one of the most romantic myths in human history. To understand how this happened, you have to start with the animal itself, because the mermaid myth isn't one story. It's a chain of misidentifications stretching across oceans and centuries. The creature most historians point to is the sirenian, the order of marine mammals that includes manatees and dugongs. These animals are slow, gentle, plant-eating, and almost nothing like the creature of legend, except for a handful of traits that, from a distance, at sea, in bad light, after months without seeing another human being, start to look uncannily human. They nurse their young by holding them close with a flipper, almost like an embrace. Their tails move in a way that, from certain angles, resembles legs fused together. And their faces, oddly enough, carry an expression that early explorers repeatedly described as strangely human. None of this makes them mermaids, but it makes them exactly the kind of animal that could be misread as one, especially by someone who wanted to see something extraordinary. Here's where the story gets more interesting. Because the animal most closely tied to the myth's darker, stranger origins isn't the manatee most people picture today. It's an animal most people have never heard of at all, Steller's sea cow. Discovered by European naturalists in 1741 off the coast of a remote island in the Bering Sea, this was not a small, gentle creature easily mistaken for anything delicate. It was enormous, stretching close to 9 meters long, roughly the length of a school bus, with thick, bark-like skin and a body built for cold northern waters rather than warm tropical lagoons. It was in every sense the giant cousin of the modern manatee, a survivor from an older world, and by the time naturalists documented it, it was already living on borrowed time. This is where the environmental context becomes essential, because Steller's sea cow didn't appear in a vacuum. It existed at the edge of a rapidly contracting range, a relic population clinging to one of the last cold-water kelp forests capable of sustaining it. Once, Sirenian's relatives were spread across a much wider stretch of the northern Pacific, but hunting pressure, shifting ocean temperatures, and the slow decline of accessible kelp beds had already pushed the species toward extinction long before European ships arrived. What sailors were witnessing in the 1740s wasn't a thriving population of sea giants. It was the final chapter of one. And that's exactly what makes the mechanics of this story so compelling, because everything that made the sea cow vulnerable also made it visible. Unlike deep-diving whales or fast-swimming seals, Steller's sea cow spent almost all its time at the surface, floating placidly while it grazed on kelp, completely unafraid of nearby ships. It couldn't dive to escape danger. Its skin was too thick and buoyant to allow it to submerge quickly, so it simply stayed there, in plain view, feeding calmly while ships sailed past. To an exhausted crew scanning the horizon for anything unusual, a slow, pale, human-sized shape drifting at the surface, sometimes cradling a calf against its body, was not a subtle sighting. It was unmistakable. And because the animal made no attempt to flee, encounters lasted long enough for imagination to fill in the gaps that biology left open. This is the turning point where curiosity becomes catastrophe, because the same trait that made the sea cow easy to romanticize also made it easy to kill. Within roughly 27 years of its formal scientific discovery, Steller's sea cow was hunted to extinction. Sailors and fur traders passing through the region killed them for meat, fat, and hide, taking advantage of an animal that had no evolved fear of humans and no ability to escape by diving. There was no ecological event, no sudden climate shift, no mass disease outbreak. It was simply an animal too visible, too slow, and too trusting for the moment in history it found itself in. By 1768, the species was gone. An animal that may have inspired centuries of maritime legend vanished within a single human lifetime of being formally recorded. Step back from the specific creature, and a larger pattern starts to emerge, one that shows up again and again across natural history. Animals that are slow, surface-dwelling, and visually striking tend to occupy an uncomfortable dual role in human culture. They become symbols before they become statistics. We mythologize what we don't understand, and we exploit what doesn't run from us. The mermaid myth isn't really about mistaken identity. It's about the space between wonder and consumption, the same narrow margin that has claimed countless species throughout history. Visible enough to inspire stories, vulnerable enough to disappear before we finish telling them. What we don't fully know is how much of the wider mermaid mythology, spanning cultures from Mesopotamia to West Africa to the Pacific Islands, actually traces back to Sirenians at all, versus stories that developed independently and later merged with sailor accounts of real animals. Some researchers argue the myth is far older than any single sighting, rooted in ancient river and sea deities long before Steller ever set foot near that Bering Sea island. Others argue the physical descriptions in later folklore align too closely with Sirenian anatomy to be coincidence. The honest answer is that both threads are probably true at once, an ancient symbolic tradition colliding with genuine repeated encounters with a real dying species. Try picturing it for a moment, not as a legend, but as an actual moment at sea. A ship becalmed near a rocky northern coastline. Gray water, colder than expected. And there, motionless at the surface, an enormous shape holding something smaller against its side, neither one moving to flee. For a sailor raised on stories of sea spirits and half-human creatures, that sighting wouldn't have felt like biology. It would have felt like confirmation. Maybe that's the real lesson hiding underneath the myth. As one way of putting it, we don't invent monsters out of nothing. We build them out of the last honest glimpse of something we were about to lose. The mermaid was never really a woman in the water. She was a warning we didn't know how to read yet, wearing the shape of an animal that couldn't outswim us. And once you see the myth that way, it stops being a story about the sea. It becomes a story about us, and about every creature since that has been beautiful enough to notice and slow enough to vanish before we understood what we were looking at.